This is Chapter 2 in 5 minutes or less. In Chapter 1, we defined management information systems as the management and use of information systems to help further a company's strategies, objectives, and goals. Where do these strategies come from? The focus of Chapter 2 is on high-level business analyses that will help drive a company's growth. Michael Porter devised a theory involving different forces that shape industry. His 5 forces of industry model helps us tie together how an information system can help further a business's goals and objectives. At the highest level, we need to understand what kind of forces are at play that affect the entire industry. Porter's 5 forces model can be broken down into 2 subcategories: competitive forces and supply forces. Competition comes from 3 places: new upstart companies that will try to take your market share and your customers, existing rivalries that may have been in business for as long as you have, and substitutions, which has to do with any alternatives that exist to your company's offerings that customers can use. For example, if we look at the automotive industry, we know that competition that comes from new companies is pretty low. It takes a lot of capital to start an automobile company, and there aren't that many people that have that kind of money or are willing to risk starting a new automobile company. We also know that competition from existing rivals is pretty high and to be expected. The competition that comes from alternatives or substitutions to automobiles is pretty low. Alternatives include walking, biking, and public transportation, and people are too reliant on their cars and too independent to switch to an alternative mode of transportation. The other forces come from supply, either a supply of customers or a supply of materials. Customers have a considerable amount of power in this situation because of the different choices that they have in purchasing vehicles. Forces related to supply of materials in the case aren't as strong. Car manufacturers have a pretty wide range of choices in picking what company will supply them with their raw materials. We can do a little more in-depth analysis of the different forces, but once you're done figuring out what forces shape your industry, you can start looking at ways to stay competitive. In this case, we see that we have our biggest concern with existing rivals and with customers. Those 2 drive the automobile industry. Of course, this all depends on who's doing the analysis. Someone else might find that there are fewer sources of raw materials than we assumed in our analysis, so their conclusion may include suppliers as a dominant force. How does a company stay competitive then? Porter says that companies can either offer customers lower prices or a better product by differentiating it from the others, or they can try to target as many people as they can or focus on a specific segment of the population. If we lay these out in a matrix, we have Porter's take on competitive strategy. In order to address the threats coming from existing rivals and from customers, a company may decide to provide a unique product that appeals to everyone. That uniqueness must be enough to compete against its rivals. It's not enough to make just another car since there are many options already on the market. They need to make a car that has features that no other car has to differentiate theirs from the others, and they need to lure in new customers of all types, not just environmentally conscious ones or trendsetters. The next step in this thought process has to do with value chains. Margin is the difference between the value of something and the cost to make it valuable, like taking raw materials and making them into a vehicle. The process of making that vehicle is the focus of value chain analysis. Each step of the process incurs cost, and if that cost is minimized, or if the value as a result of that process increases, then margin increases. Your competitive strategy comes into play here. If a company decides to create a different kind of product that appeals to everyone, their cost in raw materials, research and development, and even human resources might be high, and that company would have to find ways of saving in other areas like shipping their final products or having a customer service department on site. On the other hand, a company might decide that their competitive strategy will be to sell their products as cheaply as possible to everyone, and they might decide to get less expensive raw materials or not spend heavily on research and development. In analyzing these value chains, we need to look at the underlying processes to make sure they make sense. If a company orders their raw materials over the phone, but they are constantly receiving incomplete orders, then that whole ordering process needs to be reviewed. Perhaps they should be ordering online so that there's a digital trail of what was ordered, and so that there's no information that is lost or mistyped by the vendor. Ordering online could also increase productivity. If you're not spending too much time on the phone repeating order and payment information, you have time to do other business-related things. If we understand what the processes are, we can find ways to leverage technology to make them better. We can automate ordering raw materials, we can use a database or a spreadsheet to keep track of what we need, and we can even get fancy and connect our IS with a vendor's IS so we can see exactly how much they have and what their current price is. This high-level analysis should be done regularly. A car company may still decide that their destiny lies in addressing rivals and customers, and they may decide that their strategy will still involve differentiation. In keeping to that idea, they may decide that to create more value for their product, they need to invest in more high-end features like autonomous driving or over-the-air firmware updates. These may change some of their business processes. OTA firmware updates may require more data collection on drivers' habits and usage, and that would mean that the IS that supports these processes may need a major upgrade. This is one of the reasons we don't just buy a bunch of computers, networking gear, and software just because we need something new. Designing a good IS comes from understanding how business processes work and what exactly that IT equipment will be used for. These processes come from understanding the values associated with them. Deciding what value to create and how much to invest in the processes comes from a company's competitive strategy, which is driven by industry forces. And that's Chapter 2 in 5.